No one could have predicted that the two identical girls standing on that auction block in Richmond, Virginia, on March 15, 1839, would meet again under circumstances that would challenge everything they believed about themselves. When I discovered this account buried in the testimonies of former Underground Railroad conductors, I felt compelled to share this narrative with you. This story blends historical facts with narrative elements, but every situation described happened to real people during this dark period. The separation of families at auction blocks was one of slavery's cruelest practices, documented in thousands of slave narratives and plantation records. But before we understand how two sisters born from the same womb could stand on opposite sides of an impossible divide, we need to witness the moment their worlds were torn apart. The spring morning was cold, and 7-year-old twins Sarah and Grace stood clutching each other's hands so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Their mother had been sold 3 days earlier, her screams still echoing in their memories as she was dragged away from the slave quarters. Now it was their turn. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Whitmore, pried their fingers apart with casual cruelty. Two healthy Negro girls, twins, strong stock from good breeding, he announced to the crowd of planters and traders gathered in the square. Sold separately or together, your choice, gentlemen. What happened next would determine the course of two entirely different lives. A plantation owner from Southern Virginia named Colonel James Hartwell purchased Sarah for $300. She was loaded onto a wagon with 6 other enslaved people, her eyes never leaving her sister's face until distance made it impossible to see. Grace, meanwhile, was bought by a trader named Theodore Brennan, but not for plantation work. Brennan specialized in supplying domestic servants to wealthy northern families, and the light-skinned, well-formed girl would fetch a premium price in Philadelphia or Boston. This is where the story takes a turn that left me speechless when I first read about it in the archives. Grace's journey north ended not in servitude, but in an act of extraordinary circumstance that occasionally punctuated the horrors of that era. The ship carrying her and 12 other enslaved people to Philadelphia was intercepted by a violent coastal storm off the Delaware coast. In the chaos, as the vessel began taking on water, the chains binding the cargo broke loose. Grace, small and terrified, found herself swept overboard along with 3 others. Only she survived, washing ashore near a small Quaker settlement in New Jersey. She was found by Abigail and Thomas Whitfield, prominent abolitionists who had no children of their own. The girl was barely conscious, hypothermic, and mumbling about her sister. The Whitfields nursed her back to health, and when no one came to claim her, Brennan had reported her lost at sea and collected insurance. They made a decision that was radical for their time. They raised her as their own daughter. By law, they could have been prosecuted. By conscience, they could do nothing else. Grace grew up as Grace Whitfield. She learned to read and write, studied literature and mathematics, wore fine dresses, and attended abolitionist meetings where she heard Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison speak. She forgot, gradually, the sister whose hand she had held on that auction block. The trauma of separation had buried those early memories so deep that they surfaced only in nightmares she couldn't quite remember upon waking. She married at 24 to a merchant named Robert Caldwell, a gentleman who shared her adoptive parents' commitment to the abolitionist cause. When the Whitfields passed away in 1860, they left Grace their estate in southern Pennsylvania, a modest but respectable property with a 2-story house and 30 acres of farmland. What Grace and Robert did with that property would bring her face to face with a past she didn't know she'd forgotten. Meanwhile, Sarah's life had followed the trajectory of countless enslaved people in the Deep South. Colonel Hartwell's plantation, Ashwood, was a tobacco operation worked by 147 enslaved men, women, and children. Sarah grew up in the fields, her hands becoming calloused before her 10th birthday. She was whipped for the first time at age 9 for picking too slowly. She learned to make herself invisible, to avoid eye contact with the overseer, to endure. She married at 16, not by choice but by the colonel's order, to a field hand named Marcus. They had 3 children together. 2 survived infancy. Sarah loved Marcus with the fierce, desperate love of people who know everything can be taken away at any moment, because it had been before, and it could be again. When I read about this part of the story, I couldn't help but wonder about the memories that might have lingered in Sarah's mind. Fragments of another face exactly like her own, another small hand in hers, a connection severed but never completely erased. In the spring of 1862, with the Civil War tearing the nation apart, Marcus made the decision that would change everything. Ashwood Plantation was in chaos. Colonel Hartwell had died at Bull Run, and his son Edmund was struggling to maintain control as enslaved people began escaping in increasing numbers. The Union Army was advancing through Virginia, and freedom was no longer an impossible dream. "We're leaving," Marcus told Sarah one night in their cabin. "Tomorrow night, the children too." They left on May 3rd, 1862, joining a group of 11 others following a conductor on the Underground Railroad known only as Moses, though not the famous Harriet Tubman. This Moses was a free black man named Isaiah Cooper who had made the treacherous journey 17 times. They traveled by night, hiding in swamps during the day, moving north through a network of safe houses operated by Quakers, free blacks, and sympathetic whites. The journey took 26 days. Sarah's youngest child, 4-year-old Ruth, nearly died from fever in Maryland. They were almost caught twice by slave catchers. Marcus took a bullet in his shoulder during one encounter, but survived. They pressed on, driven by a desperate hope that somewhere north of the Mason-Dixon line, their children might grow up as human beings rather than property. On June 1st, 1862, exhausted, starving, and barely able to walk, they arrived at a station on the Underground Railroad in southern Pennsylvania. The station was a farmhouse owned by Robert and Grace Caldwell. Grace answered the door that night, carrying a lantern against the darkness. She saw 6 desperate people on her doorstep, a man with a blood-soaked bandage on his shoulder, a woman holding a sick child, 2 other children clinging to their mother's skirt, and 2 others from their escape group. Her heart, trained by years of abolitionist conviction, responded immediately with compassion. "Come in quickly," she said, ushering them into the house. "You're safe here." For 3 days, the Caldwells hid the group in their cellar, while Robert arranged transport further north to Canada. Grace tended to Marcus's wound and nursed little Ruth back from the edge of death with careful applications of cool water and feverfew tea. Sarah, gradually regaining strength, helped with household tasks, grateful beyond words for this sanctuary. It was on the 3rd evening that the impossible recognition occurred. Grace was bringing food to the cellar when she truly looked at Sarah for the first time, not as one of many desperate souls passing through, but as an individual. The lamplight fell across Sarah's face, and something in Grace's chest seized. Sarah looked up, and their eyes met with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. Neither could breathe. Neither could speak. They stood frozen, separated by 3 feet and 2 decades of entirely different lives. "I know you," Grace whispered finally, her voice trembling. "I don't know how, but I know your face." Sarah's hands began to shake. Memories she'd forced into darkness came flooding back with devastating clarity. The auction block, the cold morning, small fingers pried apart, a face exactly like her own receding into the distance. "Grace?" The name emerged from somewhere deep, a name Sarah hadn't spoken in 23 years. "How do you know my name?" Grace's lantern wobbled in her hand. "Because you're my sister," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "We were sold on the same day, Richmond, Virginia, March 15th, 1839. You were wearing a brown dress with a torn hem. The auctioneer tore us apart. I never forgot your face, not for one single day." What happens next is something I had to verify multiple times because it seemed almost unbelievable. The documentation exists in letters exchanged between the Caldwells and other abolitionists, preserved in the Pennsylvania Historical Society archives. Grace collapsed to her knees, the lantern clattering to the floor. The memories that had hidden in her nightmares came rushing back with brutal clarity. The auction block, the screaming, their mother being dragged away, that last desperate grip of a hand, exactly like her own. She had buried it so deeply, had become so thoroughly Grace Whitfield and then Grace Caldwell, that she'd convinced herself those fragments were imagination or fever dreams from her near drowning. "I didn't remember," Grace sobbed. "I didn't let myself remember." How could I forget you?" Sarah knelt beside her sister, and they held each other the way they'd held each other 23 years earlier, two 7-year-olds terrified of separation. Except now, they were 30 years old, and the chasm between them was far wider than physical distance. Grace had lived in freedom, had been educated, had never felt the lash or known hunger, or watched her children be measured for their value as property. Sarah had endured all of it. Grace spoke with the refined accent of educated northern society. Sarah spoke with the dialect of the enslaved. Grace wore silk and lace. Sarah wore the rough cotton she'd sewn herself from scraps. They were twins, identical in face and blood. They were strangers, separated by experiences no shared DNA could bridge. Robert found them there in the cellar, clutching each other and weeping. Marcus watched from the corner, protective of his wife but unsure of his place in this reunion. The children, not understanding, simply stared at the two women who looked so much alike. Over the next 3 days before the group's departure could be arranged, the sisters tried to rebuild what had been stolen from them. But every conversation revealed another gulf. Grace spoke of books she'd read, concerts she'd attended, discussions of philosophy and theology at her parents' dinner table. Sarah spoke of survival, of watching friends die, of the constant calculations required to keep herself and her children alive. "I had a mother and father who loved me," Grace said quietly one night. "I had everything, and you." "I had nothing," Sarah finished. "I had less than nothing. I was nothing in their eyes." "But you're free now," Grace said desperately, needing to believe that freedom could erase the past. "You'll go to Canada, you'll start over. You and Marcus and the children will build a life." "Will I?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "I can't read, Grace. I can't write. My hands are scarred from 20 years in tobacco fields. My back carries the marks of whips. Marcus has a bullet wound from slave catchers. Ruth nearly died on the journey here. What kind of life can we build? We survived, that's all we did. We survived." The silence between them was heavy with everything they couldn't say, the unfairness of it, the randomness of fate that had placed one in bondage and the other in freedom, based purely on which trader bought which child. "Stay," Grace said suddenly. "Don't go to Canada. Stay here. Live with us. I have money from my parents. We have the farm. There's room." "And be what?" Sarah asked gently. "Your charity case? Your living reminder of what you escaped? Your sister, the former slave, living in your house while you play mistress?" This part of the story particularly struck me because it captures something we often forget about this period. That reunion didn't always mean resolution, and that love couldn't always bridge the chasms created by slavery's brutality. Grace recoiled as if she'd been slapped. "That's not what I meant. You're my sister." "Yes," Sarah said, "I'm your sister. I'm also a woman who has survived things you can't imagine. Marcus is my husband, and he's a man who has been treated as property his entire life. Our children were born into bondage. We need to build our own lives, Grace, not live in the shadow of yours, no matter how kindly meant." They both wept then, understanding that the reunion they'd dreamed of, if Sarah had dreamed of it at all, if Grace had allowed herself to remember enough to dream, could never erase what had happened in those 23 years of separation. On June 7th, 1862, the group departed for their final journey to Canada. Grace stood on her porch, watching her sister disappear up the road, just as Sarah had watched her disappear 23 years earlier. But this time, they had addresses. This time, they had names and a promise to write. The letters between them, preserved in archives, reveal the complex relationship they built across the years that followed. Sarah and her family settled in Ontario, where Marcus found work as a carpenter, and Sarah as a seamstress. Their children attended school, the first generation to read and write. Grace sent money, which Sarah initially refused, but eventually accepted for her children's education. The letters were cordial, even warm, but they never recaptured what had been stolen on that auction block in Richmond. They saw each other 3 more times before Sarah's death in 1881. Grace visited Toronto in 1865, 1872, and 1879. The visits were always complicated, joyful and painful in equal measure, filled with love and resentment, connection and distance. They were sisters who knew each other's faces but not each other's lives, separated not just by geography, but by the unbridgeable chasm of their divergent experiences. Grace died in 1889 at the age of 57, and among her possessions was a small locked box. Inside were two items: a faded brown dress with a torn hem that she'd worn on the day of the auction. Her adoptive mother had saved it, and every letter Sarah had ever sent her. 47 letters over 27 years, each one signed "Your Sister Sarah." The final letter, written 2 weeks before Sarah's death, said simply, "I forgive you for forgetting, Grace. Perhaps I should have forgotten too. Perhaps it would have hurt less. But I couldn't forget you, not even when I tried. You were the last good thing I remembered from before." Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we get. This story raises questions that have no easy answers. Questions about fate and identity, about privilege and survival, about what we owe to family and what we owe to ourselves. Two sisters, identical in blood and birth, separated by an evil institution that measured human beings in dollars and cents. One lifted into freedom by chance and circumstance. The other pressed into bondage by that same randomness of fate. If this narrative affected you the way it affected me when I first uncovered it, I'd love to know what you think in the comments below. And if your family carries stories that echo these experiences of separations, reunions, or the complex legacies of survival, please share them with our community. These stories deserve to be remembered in all their painful, complicated truth.